Chapter 6, Brother I'm Dying, titled Goodbye. It's difficult not to idealize the brave face my uncle might have put on his suffering after his radical laryngectomy in 1978, even if what appeared to be bravery was simply an attempt at shielding his pain from others. However, it seemed to me, at 9 years old, that my uncle was adapting well to his larynx operation. Even after he could no longer speak, he continued an early morning routine of playing an old Berlitz record and mouthing a few English phrases while shaving. "Good morning," a bubbly, youthful-sounding female voice would proclaim from a scratchy LP on a turntable at his bedside. "Good evening," she'd continue. Then she'd plunge ahead to "Goodbye." Her goodbye contained none of the sadness the word implied. It was the type of goodbye one was likely to hear after a lively party, not the send-off that preceded a long absence or a death. Before my uncle's operation, he'd attempted to match her cheerfulness in his repetition. After the operation, he simply tried to mouth the joyful greetings in out-of-context phrases. Eventually, it wasn't as difficult for my uncle to communicate as I'd expected. For those who knew how to read, he'd write notes explaining complicated or elaborate thoughts. The rest of the time he used facial expressions and hand gestures. Pointing to his eyes, for example, meant look. Tugging at his ears meant listen. Pulling his hands apart meant open. Pushing them together meant close. Slapping his palm against his forehead meant he'd forgotten or overlooked something. While my uncle was not the only mute person in Bel Air, there was a boy who was born voiceless and an old woman who'd suffered a stroke. He was the only one with a tracheotomy hole in his neck. People were so curious about the hole that they kept their eyes on it throughout entire one-way conversations with him. I too was intrigued by his narrow abyss that seemed to lead deep into his body. A perfect circle, it was salmon pink like our house and convulsed outward when he sneezed. In their curiosity, some of our neighbors were cruel. I remember once walking out of our house with my uncle and hearing a young boy call out, "Kukav," or cave neck. Hearing this, the boy's mother pointed at my uncle and laughed. Her laugh was more like a self-conscious snigger than a taunt. There was almost fear in it. I'd often seen parents warn their children not to stare at the disabled or point at the infirm. "You mustn't gawk or your eyes will seal shut. If you point, your fingers will fall off." My own mother might have told me once or twice before she left. The boy's mother was laughing as though she'd been told all this yet couldn't help herself. Maybe she'd been laughing before we came by, was embarrassed that we'd caught her at it. Perhaps a comedy show was playing on the radio inside her house, and that only she and her son could hear. Still, as we walked past them, my uncle, dressed in his usual dark suit and tie, gripped my hand tightly. His body stiffened, but he held his head high and pretended not to notice. Back then, all I could think to do was imagine a wall around him, a roaming fortress that would follow him everywhere he went and shield him from derision. This fortress, cloud-cloaked in cotton candy pink, followed us that day, as I walked with him to the bank to deposit the money my parents had wired him through a money transfer service for our school fees and other expenses. One altered facet of my uncle's post-operation life was that he didn't like to go too many places by himself. Whenever he had to make a deposit at the bank or had school business at the education ministry, he would wait for either me or his grandson, Maxo's son Nick, to come back from school and take one of us with him. That way, if he wasn't able to make himself understood, either with his gestures or with his sometimes indecipherable handwriting, then one of us would interpret him. Our reward was the relief in the banker's or the clerk's eyes when he realized how much longer the transaction with my uncle would have taken had one or both of us not been there, how many eyes might have been needed to survey the requests in his notes, how many attempts at reading the lips before coming up with some possibilities to which my uncle would vigorously shake his head no or nod in agreement. My uncle would be appreciative, too, when he'd get something right. He would break into a purposely controlled grin, one designed to conceal his false teeth. His grin would have been a thunderous yes had he been able to speak, a shout to the heavens if he could have managed it. He got to the bank at a time when it was nearly empty. My uncle walked up to the young woman who was sitting behind her desk, talking on the phone. She hung up and motioned for us to sit down. The air conditioning was on full blast, filling the place with a chilled, perfumed air. My uncle handed her an envelope with some bills and his passbook in it. She pulled out the bills and counted them, laying each out in front of her. Sometimes visits like this one required no conversation or any other type of exchange that might reveal my uncle's condition. For all the woman knew, he might have been shy or ill at ease. He had been served before at that bank, but not by her. She didn't know him. When she was done counting the money, she spoke a number out loud, to which my uncle agreed with a nod. She then typed the amount in his passbook. And just as my uncle's shoulders dropped, the equivalent for him of a sigh of relief, and just as he might have been thinking he would no longer need Nick or myself to accompany him to that particular woman at that particular bank, the woman leaned forward and asked, "Tafil? Your daughter?" My uncle nodded, the same blissful nod he used to indicate agreement when something was suddenly clear to him. He smiled broadly while patting my tightly pleated hair. On the sidewalk outside the bank was a man selling grated ice sweetened with syrup, a childhood delight called Fresco. On the man's wobbly patchwork cart was a block of transparent ice half buried in sawdust and surrounded by a line of colorful bottles. My eyes followed the man's shriveled hands as he carefully tapped his grater against the ice, just as he always did, to tempt us. My uncle motioned for him to come, and the cart's rubber wheels screeched against the sidewalk as he moved toward us. "What flavor?" the Fresco seller asked, pointing to the half-full bottles glittering red, blue, yellow, and green in the sun. I pointed to the beige bottle. "Coconut." I had tried most of the other flavors, including mint and cherry, my other favorites. Because we were regular customers, the vendor poured me an especially generous amount. I twirled my tongue around the icy Fresco until the inside of my cheeks numbed. My uncle was unable to resist and gestured for a Fresco too, coconut-flavored like mine. By the time I'd finished my own, nearly 3/4 of his would be left, and reaching down to remove the empty paper cone from my hand, he would give me the rest of his. On the way home, we passed rows and rows of used booksellers whose yellowed and stained books were lined up in squares on the pavement and behind ropes on carts across from the National Cathedral. Standing before a young man with more children's books than any other kind, my uncle asked me to choose one as a gift for myself. Leaning down, I picked a book that looked familiar, a book I'd owned before. It had a nun on the cover, and on one side were her 11 little girls in raincoats, and on the other, having the luxury of an entire hand to herself, a little girl who was dressed exactly the same as the others, but stood apart somehow. The little girl's name was Madeline. I picked up the book as though picking up Madeline herself, and quickly pressed it against my chest, even as my uncle paid the seller. Unlike my first copy, which was brand new and smelled like newly printed ink, this one smelled musty and ancient. My uncle didn't have a chance to look at it long enough to see that he had bought it for me before as a birthday gift when I was 4 years old. In my family, we did not have birthday parties, and a gift on one's birthday was not a given. Actually, that first book was the only birthday gift I'd ever received from my uncle, who, perhaps knowing that would be the last birthday I'd be spending with my mother for some time, had unceremoniously given it to her to pass on to me. The book had disappeared with my things when they'd been moved from our place to Uncle Joseph and Tante Denise's, but fearing that he would think me careless, I never said a thing. Now, as we walked the short distance home, I couldn't wait to climb into bed and have another visit with my old friend Madeline, who, like me, now lived in an old house with other children. And though there were not 12 of us, there could have been, breaking our bread and brushing our teeth and going to bed, smiling at the good and frowning at the bad, and sometimes being very sad. After his operation, so that things could run smoothly, my uncle hired a principal for the school and 2 associate pastors to manage his church. Still, there were times when it was painfully clear how much he missed the full participation his voice allowed him. This would be most obvious to me when he would skip an evening service and sit motionless in the darkest corner of the front gallery while staring blankly ahead, listen to Grandma Melina tell her folk tales. Tante Denise's mother, Grandma Melina, was probably a centenarian when she came to live with us in 1979. Like many rural Haitians of her generation, she didn't have a birth certificate and could only vaguely recall, as she'd been told by her parents, that she was born when a man named Canal Bosseron was president of Haiti. Bosseron's 3-year rule from July 1876 to July 1879 put Grandma Melina's age at somewhere between 97 and 100 years. Illness had brought Grandma Melina's from the mountains to Legoan, where she'd been living since her daughter had moved to Port-au-Prince with Uncle Joseph. Ravaged by arthritis, both her pale, liver-spotted hands were curled into claw-like grips, making it impossible for her to do anything for herself. She spent most of her days sitting on the front gallery watching people go by, but as soon as the sun went down, she would sit at the center of things as she livened up and told stories. The neighborhood children rushed through their dinner and hastened to learn the next day's lessons so that they could sit on the steps beneath Grandma Melina's rocking chair and listen to her tales. One of the stories she told most often was the Rapunzel-like tale of a beautiful young girl whose mother, fearful that she might be abducted by passer-by, locked her inside a small but pretty little house by the side of the road while the mother worked in the fields until dusk. Every evening after a hard day's work, the mother would stand outside the little house and sing a simple song, which would signal to the daughter to open the door and let her mother come inside. After observing this for many weeks, a huge, deadly serpent waited until the mother was at work in the fields, and then, hoping to trick the girl into coming out, slithered to her doorstep and tried to imitate her mother's song. But the serpent hissed too loudly, so the daughter could clearly tell that it was not her mother. She did not open the door, and the serpent went away and waited for another day. When the girl's mother came home later that day from the fields, the mother sang the song, and the girl joyfully opened the door to the little house, letting her mother in. Grandma Melina's voice would grow shrill with excitement from the dangers that might lie ahead for this young girl, who was, after all, our representative in the story, the one from whose choices we were meant to extract our lesson. The next day, after the mother left for her work in the fields, the serpent returned to the girl's doorstep and once again tried to sing the mother's song. This time the serpent hissed too softly, so the daughter knew not to open the door. So the serpent went away to wait for another day. Grandma Melina's stories didn't always have happy endings. One day it occurred to the serpent that he could simply kill the mother and force the girl to come outside. And so he killed her, leaving the girl all alone in the world. Still, the girl never left her little house, preferring instead to die fresh and pure, alone inside, rather than risk facing the snake outside. Those nights, sitting at Grandma Melina's feet with the other children and listening to her often frightening stories, I would close my eyes and imagine it was my mother, who might never have cared for such tales, telling me one of them. One night, after Grandma Melina's had received a group of children on the porch, she complained of achy joints and asked Tante Denise to massage her body with camphor and castor oil before bed. Propping her up against a mound of pillows, Tante Denise, who had recently developed diabetes and was starting to look a bit sluggish and a lot less youthful herself, asked her niece Liline to slip Grandma Melina's nightgown over her head. Liline's father, Tante Denise's youngest brother, Lenoir, had left Legoan the year before to work as a cane cutter in the Dominican Republic. Liline's mother had 6 other children to look after and very little money with which to do it, so Lenoir had asked Tante Denise to look after Liline until he came back. Like Marie Micheline, Bob, Nick, and me, Liline was yet another child that Uncle Joseph and Tante Denise had not been able to turn away. Liline and I shared a metal bunk across the room from Grandma Melina. Thankfully, Grandma Melina's fragrant poultices and rub-downs would overpower the stench of urine rising from Lillian's bottom bunk. At 10, Lillian was still wetting her bed, always explaining when she was scolded by Tante Denise that she had dreamed herself peeing in a latrine when she'd soaked her mattress. I didn't know how it was decided that Lillian and I should share a room with Grandma Melina, but we liked having her all to ourselves those nights when she'd send everyone home, but still had more stories in her before she fell asleep. That evening, while Tante Denise dabbed Grandma Melina's wrinkled forehead with camphor and wrapped a scarf around her pleated cotton white hair, Grandma Melina told us the story of the singing mother, the shut-in daughter, and the snake, a story I thought was meant only to scare the neighborhood children. But I see now that the story was more about Grandma Melina than anyone. She was the daughter, locked inside a cocoon of sickness and old age, while death pleaded to be let in somehow. That night, Grandma Melina didn't finish the story, slipping into an abruptly sound sleep. Edging closer to the kerosene lamp that served as Grandma Melina's nightlight, I leafed through my Madeline, which managed to make even sickness, in Madeline's case it was appendicitis, seem like a lot of fun. The next morning, a Saturday, my brother Bob came to wake me to go out and play with him. Bob was then 9 and small for his age. A skinny, accident-prone little kid, he once had been taken to the neighborhood clinic 2 times in one day, once for a tetanus shot after he had stepped on a rusty nail walking barefoot outside, and the other for sticking a wad of cotton too far up his nose. Bob was, as always, with Maxo's son Nick, who was 10, like Lillian and me. Nick's parents had separated soon after Nick was born, his mother leaving for Canada when his father moved to New York. Nick was carrying a small tray with a piece of bread and a thermos full of coffee. Walking to his great-grandmother's bed, he lowered the tray and placed it on a flat surface at her feet. "She's still sleeping?" Nick looked down at her face. It was paler than usual, wizened and pitted. Her lips were puckered and her jaws fastened tightly as though wired together. The sheet was raised over her chest in the same place Tante Denise had carefully tucked it in the night before. I checked beneath her cot. Her chamber pot was empty. She'd been unusually quiet throughout the night, and I told the boys, never waking up to pee. "I thought she'd asked for coffee," Nick said. "Or did Maman, as how he called his grandmother, just send it?" Suddenly it occurred to me that she might be dead. I had seen a lot of dead bodies, not in their beds at home, but at viewings and funerals at my uncle's church. Before my uncle's operation, a big part of his job was to eulogize the dead, and even after his operation, he faithfully attended all church funerals, believing that children shouldn't be shielded from either the idea or the reality of death. He often brought Nick, Bob, and me with him. So the sight of a corpse was not new to us, but the task of identifying one, recognizing the transition from the living to the dead, was. "Let's hold a mirror to her nose," Bob suggested. Had he heard about someone doing this? Had he seen it in one of the comic books he and Nick were always reading? He ran out of the room and came back with one of Tante Denise's pocketbook mirrors. When he lowered the mirror to Grandma Melina's nose, the glass remained unchanged. There was no mist, no fog. Grandma Melina was not breathing. "Check her eyes," Nick suggested. Moving his face closer to Grandma Melina's, Bob pulled back one of her eyelids. Leaning in, I saw what looked like a brown marble with bright red veins wrapped around it. "Lee-Marie," he said calmly. "She's dead." "Are you sure?" Nick asked. The eyelid did not snap back by itself, so Bob had to lower it with the same index finger with which he'd raised it. By then, we were all sure. Until his operation, a death meant an eloquent homily from my uncle, a sermon that echoed my friend's declaration that indeed, every day, we are all dying. "Death is a journey we embark on from the moment we were born," he'd say. "An hourglass is turned, and the sand starts to slip in a different direction as soon as we emerge from our mother's womb. Thank God those around us are too blinded by joy then to realize it. Otherwise, there would be weeping at births as well. But if we weep at death, it's because we do not understand death. If we saw death as another kind of birth, just as the gospel exhorts us to, we wouldn't weep, but rejoice, just as we do at the birth of a child. My uncle's funeral homilies were rarely varied from this. Still, during Grandma Melina's funeral, as he sat quietly in his usual seat at the altar, he might have had more personal words in mind for his mother-in-law. For at some point during the service, when one of the associate pastors was announced, my uncle got up from his seat and raced to the pulpit. Sitting in the front pew with his sister Leon and two of her brothers, Tante Denise moved from side to side, shifting her weight uneasily. Unlike Leon, who wore a plain, short-sleeved black cotton dress, Tante Denise wore a black lace dress with matching gloves and veil. Nick leaned over and whispered to Bob and me, "What's Papa," as he called his grandfather, "doing?" We were sitting in the second row behind Tante Denise, who turned back and gave us a scolding glance as Uncle Joseph stood motionless behind the pulpit. Tante Denise wasn't one to coddle children and could have easily pulled any one of us aside for a spanking, even in the middle of her own mother's funeral service. Tante Denise turned her eyes back to the front of the church, and along with the entire congregation was once again looking up at my uncle. Had he forgotten that he couldn't speak? Should they expect some kind of miracle? But standing there as though stunned into silence, his face sullen, his eyes circling the room, Grandma Melina's death perhaps a reminder of how close he himself had come to dying, he appeared a lot more distressed than the rest of the mourners. Reaching for the microphone, he unhinged it from its stand and raised it to his lips. He opened his mouth, and just as he did every morning, along with his Berlitz record, he mouthed one word: "Goodbye." A few gasps rose from the congregation, perhaps from people who thought they had heard the same breathy murmur that those of us who were used to reading his lips and speaking for him often thought we heard. This, he seemed to want to say, was not like all other funerals he'd attended, where he'd wished he'd been able to speak but couldn't. Those of the kids who died from microbes and viruses in infancy, the adolescents crushed by careless drivers on their way to or from school, the women who fell to malaria or typhoid fever or tuberculosis, the men who were beaten or shot to death by the henchmen of Francois Duvalier, and later after his death in 1971, his replacement, the son Jean-Claude. This was a woman, an old woman, who had traveled a long way from home and who had lived a long life. He too was hoping to have a long life. He had traded his voice for a cure, but now he couldn't even properly say goodbye.